We now live in a culture in which it's actually possible to have your own facts. It used to be said that, you know, you're entitled to your opinion, but not your own facts. Well, in reality, people now consider themselves to be entitled to their own facts. And if you listen to political discourse, you see this. Now, this may seem far afield from marketing in schools, but in my view, it's not far afield at all, because the marketer's message in schools is exactly the message that supports and undergirds the values that are coarsening our civic discourse. They are: look away, be entertained, consume. Your choice is the most important choice. The individual matters more than the group in all circumstances. Choice is the highest civic value. And if I had to think about why is it so commonsensical to people that school choice would be a good public policy with regard to schools? Why is school choice so appealing? It's because we have a population that regards everything as a consumable product rather than a dynamic process of co-creation. So that if you have a population that says, I can go into it, for whom it makes sense, I can go into a grocery store and I can choose from 18 kinds of cereal, why can't I choose 18 different kinds of schools? And the alternative that are offered by these few throwbacks, some of whom are in this room with me, that say schools are about democracy, civic participation, and so on. Poor Ken Saltman must just be suffering every day. It's just not cool to talk the way you talk, Ken, because what you offer, what choice offers on its face is everybody wins. Everybody gets their choice. There really is a free lunch. There doesn't have to be any conflict. And what does Ken offer? Ken offers struggle. He offers struggle. He offers engagement. He offers getting in a room with people you don't particularly like, that have ideas that you think are sometimes stupid, and sometimes they win. And you want us to do that instead of just saying, I like these people. I choose them. I'm going to school with them, and I'm never going to talk to you. And not only that, I like Cheerios and not Fruit Loops. And so we're having Cheerios over here, and it's just that simple. So what I'm saying in kind of a frivolous way here in terms of the presentation of it is something that for me is deadly, deadly serious. Because I actually, God help me, I agree with Ken Saltman about the civic purpose of schools and civic engagement and about the necessity to struggle together to try and figure out where truth, justice lie and what a good life is. Okay? And I worry about the fact that we seem as a culture to be losing this. When I look at marketing to kids in schools, the values that I see being taught by the marketers in schools that are welcomed into schools very often are values that are harmful to children physically in terms of their health, that are harmful to children educationally and academically in terms of their ability to study serious subjects over time, that are important and difficult and that are important to us all. And therefore, I also see harms to our civic culture. And so a great deal of what I'm interested in now, and this is the segue to you, Bill, is how do you get a lever to speak against this effectively? How do you provide parents who are concerned a way to say, stop, you can't do this anymore? How do you frame policy so that people's rights and wishes are respected, but at the same time our collective lives are not degraded by this relentless march of marketing, which in my view is the apotheosis of a market system. We don't produce things, we now produce marketing. And it is corrupting us all. This is the end stage, as far as I can tell. So I'm really looking to this man seated beside me to help me, and by extension all of us, find ways that we might effectively address what I see as one of the more profound issues in education policy right now. So, Bill?
Yeah, thanks for the burden. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the introduction. It was very kind, Jared, and also thanks for the opportunity to share part of your afternoon with us to talk about this subject. And I want to make a quick comment or share an anecdote that is apropos of Alex's comment on how when he started studying this in the mid-1980s, it was viewed as a potentially career-ending move for him. Well, when I was approached by Kevin to think about writing the model legislation for this policy brief, I had, in the back of my mind, known this was an issue and had been troubled by it for quite some time. And I was troubled by the fact of marketing to children and commercialism in our schools, but even more so I was troubled by the fact that nobody seemed to be paying attention to it. So I was pretty happy to jump on this opportunity, so I called Alex up, and he may not remember this conversation, but I'll refresh his recollection. We started talking about his study of this for a long period of time, and I shared an anecdote about this scientist who's been studying this thing called the Pacific Gyre. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there is a layer of plastic particles that's about this thin, and it's the size of Texas and getting bigger. And there's no way of cleaning it up. And there's a great fear that's going to start creating big dead zones out in the ocean, because that's what it's doing. It's killing off life in the ocean in the section where it exists. And so I said to Alex, you've been studying the Pacific Gyre of education. At some point, somebody is going to recognize, some media person is going to recognize what a problem this is, and you're going to get all kinds of media attention. Just as this lonely scientist at, I think, UC Santa Barbara has received much recent media attention because he's the only one that knows anything about this thing. So there we go, Alex.
I'm still waiting, but yeah. Thanks, Bill.
So in our brief, we've outlined the nature and the extent, to the extent we know the extent, of commercialism in schools. And it takes a number of different shapes and forms. And I encourage you to take a look at the brief if you want to see in real nuts and bolts ways that marketers get into our classrooms, and some of the things you're probably pretty familiar with, advertising at baseball stadiums and things like this in high schools. Maybe there are placards on buses, vending machines, those things. But there are other ways that are much more insidious. Fundraising, to me, is one of the big things. If you have these companies that will say, if you are able to sell this much of our product, we will give you this kind of a matching grant for your school or something like that. So take a look at the brief if you want to know what this marketing actually looks like. Alex outlined what we feel to be the harms that come from these marketing efforts by corporations. And those harms are, as Alex says, psychological and in some ways ethical harms. I would consider it to be an ethical harm. Health and physical well-being, harms to individual children and our public health. Educational harms, as Alex mentioned, and potentially fiscal harms, especially if the deal that schools are cutting, if we market your product in our school, you will give us money, especially if that deal turns out to be what it looks like, a bad deal, that the money you actually get doesn't in any way, shape, or form match the amount of time and energy that you put into marketing somebody else's materials. So the question that I want to ask in the few minutes that I have here, and I want to go a little bit beyond the brief that we produced, which was mainly focused on establishing a regulatory or legislative framework for dealing with marketing in the schools. I want to ask the question, can any of these harms be prevented or remedied through legal action? And if so, what should be the best, or what would be the most promising legal or policy strategy available to us to begin to combat commercialism in the schools? And by way of outline, I want to first take a bit of a turn off to the side of digression and dismiss an objection that some might hear from time to time regarding the regulation of marketing to children in schools, and that is corporations have their own free speech rights and they should get to do this. And then I'll talk about some potential litigation avenues, and this is where the boring technician comes into play. I mean, I'm just a lawyer hack at the end of the day, and this is the way I think. So you're going to get a little bit of technical detail there. And then finally, talk a little bit about some of the things we mentioned in our brief, some of the potential regulatory responses to this. So let's get rid of that distraction first. Efforts to regulate advertising largely, writ large, in the past have sometimes run afoul of First Amendment concerns. Yes, corporations are people, and yes, they have First Amendment free speech rights. And there is actually this doctrine that our Supreme Court, in its wisdom, has established called commercial free speech. And if government generally wants to get out there and regulate advertising, they have to balance it against the free speech rights of corporations. I guess the thinking from a philosophical perspective is that on the one hand, we want to protect the public somehow, and specifically in schools, we viewed schools as this sheltered place where children can learn to become good, civically engaged citizens, on the one hand, versus this idea that, in fact, the necessity of allowing commercial advertising to inform the public so that we can have a more robust free market economy. It strengthens the free market, essentially, to have commercial free speech. So that's why this doctrine exists in the first place. I will just say right now that, at least in the context of schools, if this ever gets raised, you can poo-poo it during your cocktail conversations, because guess what? Using commercial free speech as the doctrine to apply in this instance is incorrect. Why? Because public schools are public property. And the way that you would look at regulation on public property is through a different lens, and that is, to what extent have schools made themselves available to the outside world for free speech activities? And the answer is, to a very, very limited extent. This is not a public forum, in other words. A public forum where anybody, once the door is open, should be allowed to express their viewpoints, including corporations. That's just not true with schools. And so anybody who might make this objection, we can brush that aside. Okay, that digression aside, just in case anybody was going to stand up, somehow I doubt it in this room, but somebody might have stood up and said, what about the rights of corporations? No, forget about it.
Oh, they're out there.
Yeah, you out there?